For most of us, this is what American history looks like. But the real history of America is down here in the dirt. And the archaeological history of America that we uncover will be the story of all of us. And modern archaeologists are using some of the most advanced scientific investigation techniques to uncover America's hidden history. And over the next 6 episodes, we're going to dig into the hidden story of America's frontier. It's a story that takes place in the spectacular forts, cities, and sites along the inland water highways of North America. Archaeology is like detective work. This could be a shovel of dirt, some rocks, organic matter, a little bit of vegetation. But if you look closely and you know what you're looking for, it could be the voice of America's past. Centuries before the arrival of the first Europeans, as many as 35,000 people lived in the largest city in prehistoric America. But by 1400, that city was abandoned. An entire civilization vanished. Who were these people? What were they doing here? And what happened to them?
It's all down there. The houses, temples, burials of this magnificent, enigmatic city. Our job is to use all the tools in our archaeological toolkit to find out what happened here.
For most of us, the history of colonial America is all about places like Boston, Philadelphia, Jamestown, and the British settlement of the eastern seaboard. But the archaeological history of North America tells a different story. Out here on the frontier, the story is as likely to be French and Native American as it is British. It's a story that's recorded in the sites, the cities, and the Native American settlements across the continent. This episode is the story of the Europeans and their relentless pursuit of material wealth colliding head-on with the geopolitical culture of Native North America. Because archaeology is the study of material culture, it can add flesh and blood to the bare bones of historical narrative. And that narrative is no more real than here in the spectacular walled city of Quebec. So then, when archaeologists talk about excavation, what do we mean?
Basically, it's controlled digging, and by controlled, the first thing we have to do is know where we are in space, and so we establish a grid. You can see our bright pink strings here. We do hand excavation here, so we use mason's trowels.
We are finishing up the base of our level 2. So that is there's the sod level, which is where we remove all of the sod. And then there's levels 1 through however deep you have to go. And each level, the way we're doing it, is 10 centimeters.
One of the costliest wars in American history is a war that most of us probably know very little about. If you saw it in the history books, it was called the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. But in reality, it's a global conflict fought between ancient European enemies for colonial supremacy. And the outcome would have major repercussions for the French, for the British, the colonials, and the Indians.
And in this episode, the archaeological story that we uncover is going to be the real history of World War America.
Starting at Quebec on the St. Lawrence, from Detroit and Mackinac on the Great Lakes, and down the Mississippi to New Orleans, New France formed a semicircle around the British colonies in North America.
The British colonies suffered from mounting population pressure, and renewed hostilities in Europe only fed the fires of conflict with the French.
In contrast to New France, with its loosely connected network of forts and trading centers, The British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard were more tightly administered, they were more heavily populated, and they were more hostile to native peoples. When it comes to the history of America's fight for independence from the British, we all know the story about George Washington and Valley Forge, about Boston and the Tea Party and the traitor Benedict Arnold. But the real story of the American Revolution was played out here in the dirt. And out here on the inland waterways of North America, it's a struggle between the British, the Canadians, the Americans, and the Indians. The American Revolution was a world war fought between colonials, Europeans, and Native Americans. The pitched battles and lightning raids on forts and villages and settlements that were stretched out along the continent's lakes and rivers tell a story where Europeans, Native Americans, and colonials all fought for their own individual interests.
The story of the American Revolution on the frontier of Canada is about the struggle to control the inland water highways, including the St. Lawrence River, Lake Champlain, and the Great Lakes.
Archaeological study at that Revolutionary War battlefield site to try and both learn about the archaeology of the battlefield, how the events unfolded, to really help illustrate the history that we know about that battle. And then really importantly, in fact I would argue even more important than the archaeology, is we wanted to address what is the main threat to that battlefield. And that is the removal of artifacts by well-intentioned folks, divers there wanting to touch a true piece of history, because the history is there. But what we wanted to do was provide an archaeological outlet, a permitted project, scientific methodology, and then once we had an understanding of the way the site laid out, we did some selective artifact recovery permitted by the state of New York and the Navy for things like the pieces of this cannon and the carriage and some other smaller artifacts.
Everybody loves a mystery, and adventure is like catnip in the classroom. Archaeology is where science meets history in the dirt, and with this series, we set the bar high, working with many of America's top historians and archaeologists. As a result, we've put together an entire episode about the STEM connections between archaeology and history.
So core sampling, along with other non-invasive techniques like magnetic resistivity and other geophys, allows us to really look inside a mound almost like an X-ray without actually having to dig it open.
Right. This really represents a new era in archaeology where we can do either non or minimally invasive techniques to explore archaeological sites.
And this new technology allows us to examine sites that are not just on dry land, but underwater as well.
We're not really disturbing the wreck at all. We're mapping it, but in terms of, if we go down and touch it and move things around and excavate around it, that's going to be an invasive process. This seems pretty non-invasive.
So what we're doing here is we're using sound to document a wreck. It's a scanning 3D sonar. It takes really only those acoustic pictures of the wreck, and it leaves it exactly the way it was when we started. So
when we're finished, we're going to have a complete map and a 3D image of the wreck and the site, and as you finish the whole area, those can all be stitched together, that's exactly and you'll have a complete three-dimensional map of the lake bed without ever having to actually disturb anything.
That's exactly right.
For most of us, the British burning of the White House is the iconic symbol of the War of 1812. But the continuing struggle for American independence from Britain wasn't just being fought in the original 13 colonies.
It was a frontier war fought for control of the inland water highways of North America.
Out here on the frontier, in massive naval battles on the lakes and rivers, in fierce battles at places like Prophetstown, and in forts and settlements across the West, the War of 1812 was a wilderness war. When most of us think about naval engagements in the War of 1812 or the Revolutionary War, we might imagine the massive battles that are taking place for places like New York and Boston. But the reality is, out here on the Great Lakes, the battles are just as fierce as those being fought on the high seas. It's a war in which the British and their native allies and the Americans and their native allies fought for the control of a continent. It's America's second war for independence.